Greetings, friend, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where we slow down together and let remarkable lives unfurl like a quiet story by the bedside. Tonight we follow a different kind of thinker, not a revolutionary with banners, but a patient listener with a lamp and a stack of papers. His name is Edward Hallett Carr. Before we begin, a small request. If these calm journeys help you unwind, please consider tapping like and subscribing. It quietly helps other curious minds discover these evenings. And we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what part of Carr's life intrigues you most, or who you'd like us to visit next. Now, Carr's life isn't built from flashpoints alone. It is made of telegram lights in dim offices, night trains, lecture halls smelling of chalk, and the steady scratch of a pen in a quiet study. He began life at the turn of the century, learned to read ancient texts by candlelight, and then found himself, like many of his generation, shaped by war and the difficult work of making peace. He moved from government corridors into the newsroom, and from there into the calm, demanding work of the archive. He wrote about how nations behave, and he asked how historians themselves shape the stories they tell. His view of the world shifted over a long life, from the careful diplomacy of Whitehall to urgent editorials under blackout lamps, to patient, multi-volume histories that tried to listen to the past as closely as possible. Tonight we are not here for polemics or for neat verdicts. We are here to meet the man behind the sentences, the curious, sometimes stubborn, always thoughtful mind who wanted to understand how ideas and power shape people's lives. We'll follow him through doubt and discovery, through personal solitude and public debate, and we'll pay close attention to the small human moments that shaped his judgments. So, let the day unwind. Brew something warm, or simply lie back and breathe slowly. We'll begin gently. Chapter 1. Rain on Cambridge Stones. Imagine London at the end of the 19th century. Streets still marked by horse hooves, gas lamps flickering softly against damp stone. It is here, in 1892, that Edward is born into a calm, respectable household. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just the steady rhythm of middle-class life, filled with books, conversation, and an unspoken belief that the world is moving forward. As a boy, Edward is observant, not loud, not reckless. He watches more than he speaks. At school he does well, but what sets him apart is not brilliance alone. It is curiosity. A quiet habit of asking why things are the way they are, and who decided they should be so. At Merchant Taylor's School, he moves through long corridors and orderly classrooms, surrounded by boys who inherit certainty from their homes. Edward does not. Even then, he senses that opinions are shaped by upbringing, by comfort, by fear. He begins to understand that ideas are not neutral. They belong to people, and people belong to their time. When he earns a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge, the world opens further. Cambridge greets him with ancient stone, clipped lawns, and the soft echo of footsteps under archways worn smooth by centuries of thought. Rain is frequent here. It darkens the cobblestones. It taps patiently against windows as students bend over books late into the night. Edward studies classics, Greek, Latin, civilizations long gone. At first, history feels solid. Dates, battles, speeches preserved like fossils. But slowly, something shifts. One afternoon, listening to a lecture on ancient wars, Edward feels a small but powerful realization settle in. The past does not speak on its own. It is spoken for, chosen, arranged, filtered through the mind of the historian. This thought does not arrive with drama. It arrives gently, like rain soaking into stone. But it stays. He begins to read differently, not just asking what happened, but why this story was told and not another. Who is being listened to? Who is being ignored? History, he starts to see, is not a mirror. It is a conversation. Evenings in Cambridge are quiet. The soft rustle of pages. A distant bell marking the hour. Edward walks along the river, hands in his coat pockets, thoughts drifting. He feels a restlessness he cannot yet name. A sense that the world he is preparing to enter is more fragile than it appears. By the time he finishes his studies, he is no longer simply a student of the past. He is a young man carrying questions that will not let him rest. Questions about truth, about power, about how stories shape the future. As rain falls once more on the stones of Cambridge, we leave Edward here, poised at the edge of adulthood, standing quietly before a century that will test every idea he holds dear. If this gentle journey into history brings you comfort, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe for future stories. And if you wish, share in the comments whose life you'd like to explore next. For now, as this chapter draws to a close, we leave Edward Carr in rooms far from the battlefield, yet shaped by the war all the same. Here, among telegrams and careful phrases, his faith in effortless progress begins to fade. He learns that history is not guided by goodwill alone, but by fragile decisions made under strain. For now, let the wires fall quiet. The war continues beyond the walls, and Carr carries forward a new awareness that peace, once broken, is never easily restored. Let's start Chapter 2. We step into a darker chapter of Edward Carr's early life, a time when the world he trusted began to fracture. It is the year 1914. Europe exhales and then holds its breath. War spreads across the continent like a sudden winter storm. Edward Carr is in his early 20s. Cambridge is behind him now, but its calm order feels very far away. The newspapers grow heavier each morning. Names of places once studied in books now appear beside casualty lists. Because of fragile health, Edward does not go to the trenches. Instead, in 1916, he enters the British Foreign Office. It is quieter there, but no less intense. Picture a government building in London. Long corridors, high windows dulled by coal smoke, desks crowded with papers, maps, and hurriedly typed telegrams. The soft clatter of typewriters never quite stops. Edward is young, junior, learning quickly. His days are spent reading cables from embassies, reports from capitals under strain, fragments of fear, strategy, and hope, condensed into careful language. Every word weighed, every phrase chosen to avoid catastrophe. At night, the city is darkened by blackouts, street lamps dimmed, curtains drawn tight. Edward walks home through streets that feel unfamiliar, even to those who have lived there all their lives. The war is not abstract here. It arrives in envelopes, in casualty figures, in the exhausted handwriting of men trying to prevent worse outcomes. For the first time, Edward sees how decisions are truly made, not by grand ideals alone, but by compromise, by fear, by necessity. He watches experienced diplomats struggle to balance morality with survival. He learns that good intentions do not guarantee good results, that peace is negotiated not by angels, but by tired humans working under pressure. Something subtle changes in him. The confident belief in progress he inherited from childhood begins to soften, not disappear, but crack. He starts to notice patterns, how power shapes language, how nations speak differently when they are winning and when they are afraid, how ideals are often adjusted quietly behind closed doors. There are moments of pride. Serving the country feels meaningful. There are also moments of doubt, when he wonders whether the machinery of diplomacy can truly prevent disaster or merely delay it. The war drags on. Years pass in a blur of documents and decisions. By the time the fighting ends, Edward is no longer the same young man who entered the office. He has learned patience. He has learned restraint. And he has learned that history is not driven only by noble ideas, but by human limits. Late at night, after the last telegram is filed away, Edward sometimes sits alone at his desk. The building quiet at last. He imagines the peace that will follow, and wonders, quietly, whether it will be strong enough to last. Part 2 ending. Telegram lights and twilight trenches. As the telegram lights dim and the night settles over the Foreign Office, Carr carries with him a new, quieter doubt about progress. Hold that thought gently. Next, we step into the smoke-filled rooms of Paris and watch how peace is being written. Let's start Chapter 3. We step into a room thick with smoke, ambition, and uneasy hope. Paris, in the year 1919. The war has ended, but peace has not yet arrived. Outside, the city is alive again. Cafes glow late into the evening. Carriages roll over cobblestones still marked by years of strain. Inside grand buildings, men gather to decide the future of Europe. Edward Carr is there, young, carefully dressed, quietly attentive. The Paris Peace Conference unfolds in long sessions behind closed doors. Rooms filled with cigar smoke and murmured translations. Maps spread across tables like fragile skin. Borders drawn and redrawn in pencil, as if nations were temporary sketches. Carr works as part of the British delegation, drafting memoranda, reviewing proposals, watching history take shape line by line. At first, there is excitement, a sense that something new can be built from the ruins, a belief that suffering might finally give way to wisdom. But as days turn into weeks, that optimism thins. Carr watches defeated nations summoned, not as partners but as subjects. Terms are announced, not discussed. Punishments proposed with certainty, as if resentment were a manageable force. He listens as moral language fills the room. Justice, responsibility, deserved consequences. Yet beneath the words he senses something colder. Fear, pride, the quiet desire to secure advantage while the moment allows it. Carr begins to feel uneasy. In the margins of documents he makes careful notes. Questions, not accusations. Concerns about borders drawn without regard for people who live there. Warnings that humiliation rarely produces stability. He is not shouting, not rebelling. He is observing and remembering. When discussions turn harsh, Carr feels the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. These are not abstract debates. They will shape real lives, real futures. He starts to understand that peace imposed is not the same as peace made, that moral certainty can become dangerous when it refuses to listen. Outside, Paris continues its slow return to normal life. Music drifts through open windows. Waiters carry trays through evening air. Inside the conference halls, the atmosphere grows heavier. Eventually, the treaty is finalized. Signatures are placed. Applause rises, polite and restrained. Carr receives recognition for his service, an honor, a formal acknowledgement of contribution. But inwardly, he feels unsettled. As the conference winds down, the room's empty. Chairs pushed back. Maps rolled away. The smoke clears. Carr walks through quiet corridors, aware that something fragile has been created. A peace that may last, or may fracture under the weight of its own unfairness. On the journey home, he carries more than documents. He carries a growing conviction that history is not a courtroom delivering final verdicts. It is a process, shaped by choices and consequences that echo far beyond their moment. As the train moves through the countryside, Carr looks out at the passing landscape. Fields at rest, villages untouched by the arguments of powerful men. And he wonders quietly whether fairness denied today will return tomorrow as grievance. If this story brings you calm, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe for more gentle journeys through history. You may also share your thoughts if you wish. Part 3 ending. Smoke-filled rooms at Versailles. The conference halls fall silent and the maps are rolled away, leaving Carr with unease more than triumph. Keep that quiet question with you. Now we cross the Baltic towards Riga, where new languages and new lives reshape his view. Let's start Chapter 4. We follow Edward Carr to a quieter part of the world, where the sea air sharpens the mind and new languages open like keys. Imagine a port city on the Baltic. Gulls wheel over a wide river. Fog sometimes clings to the quay, softening the edges of warehouses and spires. This is Riga in the mid-1920s, a place of old stone and new tensions, a place where east brushes west, and stories from both sides gather in small cafes. Edward arrives as a young diplomat. He carries a case of papers and a careful manner. At first, his work is the work of the office. Reports, notes. Late afternoons bent over dispatches by lamplight. But the city itself begins to speak to him in ways ink cannot capture. He meets people whose voices are layered with different histories. Exiles who remember another empire. Traders who move between languages. Students who argue politics into the night. Riga's streets teach him a lesson he will carry for the rest of his life. History lives in the small details of daily life, not only in treaties and atlases. It is here that his life changes in gentle, human ways. He meets Anne. She is a woman of quiet charm and steady presence. Their lives slowly fold together, not in grand declaration, but in the ordinary rhythm of shared meals, laughter in the evening, and small kindnesses that feel like shelter. Soon their son is born, a boy named John. A soft, newborn cry in a rented room becomes part of Edward's world. Parenthood arrives like a new instrument in a familiar song. Work continues. Dispatches still pile on his desk. But the baby's breath and the creak of a rocking chair bring a new warmth to the long hours. Outside the office, the libraries call to him. He begins to learn Russian. At first, it is a stubborn exercise, the shapes of letters different from anything he has known. He sits with a slow pen, tracing unfamiliar scripts, tasting the sound of words on his tongue. There is a patient joy in this, the joy of someone who discovers that another language can reveal another way of seeing. He reads Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. He reads the novelists late into the night, the bedside lamp casting a pool of light over pages thumbed by careful fingers. These writers do not only tell stories, they press on the human heart. They reveal contradictions. They teach him to listen closely to voices that have been silenced in his own world. Riga has its cafes where exiles exchange news, sometimes bitter, sometimes bright. Edward slips into these rooms, not as an intruder, but as a student. He listens to talk of revolutions and to quiet reminiscences of lost homes. He learns that ideas travel with people, and that those ideas change slightly wherever they land. In 1927, he travels to Moscow for the first time. Picture the city under a hard, distant sky, smoky chimneys and wide avenues, a vastness that humbles the visitor. There is grandeur and scarcity together. Factories stand near neat squares. Old churches watch the new order with quiet stone faces. In Moscow, he meets scholars and writers. He sees new institutions and the traces of the past they try to transform. There are moments of admiration and moments of unease. He does not accept everything he reads at face value. He measures, questions, and records. Back in Riga, he begins to write more publicly. Because of his diplomatic position, he often uses a pen name, a quiet name to separate his office life from his emerging voice. Under that name, he begins to publish essays and reviews on Russia and on international life. His writing is careful and observant. It bears the marks of someone who reads slowly and thinks more slowly still. At home, the small domestic scenes become anchors. A shared breakfast, a child's giggle, the scraping of chairs on wooden floors. These ordinary moments balance the weight of books and dispatches. They remind him that ideas are not just theories. They touch real people, with small needs and surprising kindnesses. Yet the wider world presses in. Political shifts in neighboring countries arrive in headlines and in the hushed comments of friends. Edward notes them down. He tries to understand how ideas on paper translate into actions on streets. He begins to suspect that reading novels and reading reports are both necessary. Each offers a different kind of truth. There are nights when the wind from the Baltic blows cold through the shutters. Edward sits at his desk, a cup of tea cooling at his elbow. He thinks about the languages he is learning. He thinks about the faces he has seen in Moscow and Riga. He writes draft after draft, assembling thoughts that will later be read by others. This period reshapes him. The man who once approached history as a sequence of dates now approaches it as a conversation between people, languages, and longings. He learns to hear the past in the voices of ordinary citizens. He learns that a nation's mood can be caught in a market stall or in a line outside a bakery, as much as in a parliamentary speech. When he leaves Riga years later, he carries with him more than notes and reports. He carries a new habit of listening. He carries a tenderness for the quiet human details that mean so much. He has learned that empathy, like any language, must be practiced. As we close this chapter, imagine the Baltic shore at dusk. A low sun gilds the water. A man walks home with a child on his shoulders and a book in his hand. He is not finished with his questions, but he is closer to the people who will help him answer them. If this gentle hour with history has offered you calm, you might like the video or subscribe for more stories told this way. And if you wish, leave a thought in the comments about which life we should visit next. Part 4 ending. Baltic haze and Russian books. Riga slips behind him, but the Russian books and the people he met remain, softening his view of history as a ledger and turning it into a conversation. With that listening newly tuned, we move on to a world shaken by economic collapse and hard choices. Let's start Chapter 5. We sit with Edward Carr at a moment when the ground beneath the world begins to shift. It is the early 1930s. The rhythm of everyday life stumbles. Markets falter. Factories slow. Newspapers grow heavier in the hand. Across Europe and beyond, the Great Depression settles in like a long, grey winter. Jobs vanish. Savings thin. Certainties that once felt solid begin to crack. Edward feels this change not as a sudden shock, but as a steady pressure. Each morning, he unfolds the paper and reads of bank failures, unrest, and governments struggling to respond. The confident, liberal world he grew up believing in no longer seems inevitable. He is still working within the Foreign Office, still drafting reports, still measuring words carefully. But his thoughts no longer rest easily within old assumptions. Late in the evenings, after the day's duties are finished, Edward sits by a lamp that burns low and steady. He reads widely. Economic reports, political theory, accounts from places trying different paths. One country, in particular, draws his attention: the Soviet Union. While much of the capitalist world contracts, Soviet factories expand. Plans are drawn up, production targets set. There is hardship, yes, but also momentum. Edward does not romanticize what he sees. He notices the strain, the rigidity, the human cost. But he also notices something else: direction, purpose. A belief that society can be organized deliberately rather than left to drift. These observations unsettle him. In his earlier years, Edward had dismissed Marx with sharp words. He had found the language excessive, the ideas too rigid, too confident in their conclusions. Now, he rereads those texts, more slowly, more carefully. He does not suddenly convert. There is no dramatic reversal. Instead, there is a quiet reassessment, an acknowledgement that perhaps he had judged too quickly, that beneath the rhetoric lay questions worth taking seriously. What happens when markets fail? Who bears the cost of collapse? Can societies plan for fairness or only react to crisis? These questions press on him as the world around him grows louder and more divided. Inside the Foreign Office, his views begin to place him at odds with colleagues. Edward questions long-held policies. He challenges assumptions about trade, power, and stability. He warns that economic despair can breed political extremism. Not everyone appreciates this tone. Meetings grow tense. His memoranda are read with raised eyebrows. He senses a narrowing of patience around him. The institution prefers continuity. Edward is beginning to look elsewhere. At home, the atmosphere is quieter, but no less thoughtful. Books pile up on tables. Margins fill with notes. Ideas are tested, crossed out, returned to again. He feels anxiety, but also a strange clarity. The feeling that old maps no longer match the terrain. That new thinking, however uncomfortable, is necessary. Outside, the streets are busy with people adapting as best they can. Shops closing early. Men lingering near factory gates. Conversations in low voices about what might come next. Edward watches all of this with a historian's patience and a citizen's concern. He understands now that ideas are not luxuries. They are tools people reach for when the world no longer makes sense. As the decade moves on, Edward stands at a crossroads. between the assumptions of his youth and the uncertainties of the present, between loyalty to an institution and loyalty to inquiry. In the quiet of the evening, lamplight pooling on the desk, he folds the newspaper and sets it aside. He knows that some beliefs will not survive this moment, but he also knows that new ones must be examined carefully, without haste. And so we leave him there, alone with his thoughts, listening to a world in transition, wondering which ideas, tested by strain and time, might still hold firm. If this story helps you unwind, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe for more gentle journeys through history. You may also share your reflections if you wish. Part 5 ending of Crashes and Crossroads. When markets stagger and old certainties wobble, Carr finds himself at a crossroads between what he once believed and what the moment demands. Let that crossroads linger. Next we go to the quiet of the Welsh coast, where thought deepens by the sea. Let's start Chapter 6. We follow Edward Carr away from the corridors of power and toward the sea. It is the year 1936. Whitehall is behind him. The memoranda, the careful phrasing, the quiet constraints of government service all begin to loosen their grip. Carr arrives in Aberystwyth, a small Welsh town pressed gently against Cardigan Bay. The air smells of salt and rain. Waves roll in with steady patience, unconcerned with empires or treaties. The town feels modest, almost shy, compared to London's weight. Here, Carr becomes a professor, the Woodrow Wilson Chair of International Politics. A title that sounds grand, but the reality is quieter. Lecture halls with creaking floors, students wrapped in coats against the coastal chill. Windows that look out toward the sea, where thoughts can drift as easily as clouds. For the first time in years, Carr feels space around his thinking. No cables to approve, no official lines to maintain. Only ideas and the responsibility of explaining them honestly. In his lectures, he begins to speak more boldly. He questions the League of Nations, not angrily, not dismissively, but with calm insistence. He explains to his students that goodwill alone does not guarantee peace, that international systems built only on shared hopes, without regard for power and interest, are fragile. He urges them to look at the world as it is, not as they wish it to be. Some listeners are unsettled, others lean forward, attentive. Carr does not mind disagreement. He has learned that intellectual comfort is rarely a sign of truth. Between lectures, he walks along the shore, wind tugging at his coat, gulls calling overhead. The rhythm of the tide becomes a kind of companion. It steadies him. During this period, Carr travels again, to the Soviet Union, to Germany. These journeys deepen his thinking, but also complicate it. In the Soviet Union, he observes rapid transformation, industrial energy, strict organization, a sense of historical momentum that both impresses and disturbs him. He does not ignore the rigidity, but he notices the determination. In Germany, he sees a different kind of order, one that feels disciplined on the surface, confident, purposeful. At the time, Carr misjudges what he sees. He focuses on stability, on national confidence. Only later will he fully grasp the cost beneath that appearance. One encounter during these travels leaves a quiet mark on him. He reconnects with an old acquaintance, a Russian intellectual named Mirsky. They meet briefly, talk over lunch, exchange words that seem harmless at the time. Soon after, Mirsky disappears, caught in forces Carr does not see coming. The news arrives later, fragmented and unclear. Carr does not dramatize this moment. He carries it silently. A reminder that observation is never neutral, that presence alone can alter outcomes. Back in Aberystwyth, the sea remains unchanged. Lectures resume. Students come and go. But Carr feels the weight of unintended consequences more keenly now. He understands that ideas have reach, that analysis does not exist in isolation, that even careful thought can ripple outward in ways no one intends. Evenings find him at his desk, the sound of waves faint but constant beyond the window. He writes. He revises. He prepares arguments that will soon take clearer shape. This period becomes a threshold between public service and public scholarship, between restraint and intellectual freedom. As lectures end for the day and the tide returns once more to the shore, Carr senses both relief and responsibility. Freedom to think, and the knowledge that thought itself carries weight. Part 6 ending. Waves on Cardigan Bay. By the shore, ideas breathe more freely, but freedom brings weighty responsibility. Words said here will travel far. Keep the tide's rhythm in mind. Now we return to London, where realism sharpens as war edges closer. Let's start Chapter 7. We sit with Edward Carr at a decisive bend in his life, a time when ideas meet the hard edge of events. Imagine London in the late 1930s. The air is damp and close. Newspapers pile on doorsteps. Conversations in clubs and cafes lean toward anxious tones. People who had once believed in smooth progress now speak of instability and fear. Carr is at his desk, papers scattered like quiet islands of thought. For years he had watched the world try to stitch itself back together after the First World War. He had seen leagues of good intentions, treaties signed with flourish, and promises made to keep peace. Yet the promises did not hold. He begins to write a book. Not a light book. A careful, stern attempt to think through 2 decades of failure. He examines how often noble talk about law and morals failed when confronted with raw national interest. He looks closely at the way ideals could be used as cover for power, or how good intentions could be starved by complacency. The book finds a small, patient voice. It does not shout. It simply insists that we see the world as it is before deciding how it should be. This is the work that would become the 20 Years Crisis. It is both an analysis and a personal plea, an appeal to face facts even when facts make us uncomfortable. Carr argues softly but firmly that international life has 2 faces. One is the face of hope and principle. The other is the face of power and interest. Both exist. Both matter. To ignore either is to risk misunderstanding the whole. He calls for a realism rooted in careful attention, not cynicism, not surrender, but a sober willingness to reckon with how states act when survival and advantage are at stake. This realism asks questions about balance, about prudence, about what can be reasonably achieved. As he writes, there is a sense of urgency threading through his sentences. He senses that the age of experiments in idealism is coming to a hard close. The time for polite theories has run against history's rough current. When the book appears, some find it harsh. Others find it clarifying. It becomes a quiet touchstone for those trying to make sense of what has gone wrong. At the same time, Carr is changing his own path. Years of service inside government corridors had taught him the limits of official life. He had learned to shape language under constraint, to soften arguments so they might pass through careful channels. but he had also felt the small frustrations of not being able to speak plainly. Leaving the Foreign Office had been a slow unfastening. It was not a dramatic departure. It was the gradual choice to move from shaping policy behind closed doors to shaping debate in the open. He wanted to write more freely, to argue more plainly. So he turned to journalism. Newspapers offered a different kind of reach, a way to place ideas before a wider public, to test them in daylight rather than in shadowed rooms. At the Times, his editorials aimed to nudge public conversation, to press for a realistic appraisal of the world's dangers and possibilities. Working at a paper in wartime London was a different rhythm. There were deadlines, of course, and the daily demand for clarity. There were also the quiet satisfactions of reaching readers who were not specialists, readers who might be deciding their own views in the cafes and drawing rooms of a tense nation. In these years, Carr's tone is steady. He writes with the voice of someone who has seen the small machinery of diplomacy up close. He knows how easy it is for high principles to be trimmed away in the face of immediate danger. He also knows that power unused can invite worse harms. But his realism is not merely tactical. It carries a moral seriousness. He argues that honesty about limits can be the beginning of better choices. Admitting what cannot be done might open the way to what can be done, with prudence and care. This stance draws critics. Some accuse him of abandoning hope. Others call him too cautious. Yet he does not seek popularity. He seeks understanding and a clearer path through perilous times. There are moments when he sits quietly after a long day of writing. The city outside is dim under blackout curtains. The distant sound of an air raid siren might be felt rather than heard, a ponderous reminder of danger. Inside, the lamplight pools over his notes. He thinks about the students he once taught by the sea. He remembers their eager faces and their earnest questions about justice and peace. He hopes his words will help them think more clearly, without stealing their ideals. For Carr, realism is not a doctrine to replace morality. It is a tool to shape moral choices so they might stand a chance in an unruly world. It asks that we be neither naive nor merely strategic. It asks that we be honest about trade-offs and steady in the face of complexity. As the drums of war grow louder, he tightens his pen. He watches ideals collide with the hard facts of power. And he writes, trying to keep both compassion and prudence alive in the same paragraph. If this hour in Carr's life has given you a quiet thread to follow, you may like the video or subscribe for more evenings like this. If you wish, leave a thought in the comments about which life we should visit next. Part 7 ending. Realism at the edge of war. As the world tips toward conflict again, Carr chooses sober sight over easy hope, learning that prudence and compassion must coexist. Hold that steady gaze. Next, under blackout curtains and typewriter lamps, he writes for a nation at war. Let's start Chapter 8. We sit with Edward Carr during the long hours of war, when cities go dark and ideas burn brighter under lamplight. London, 1940. The streets are dimmed by blackout curtains. Windows glow faintly, like embers carefully hidden. Above, the sky hums with distant aircraft, and below, people move quietly, mindful of shadows. Carr now works at a newspaper, The Times. He is no longer drafting private memoranda meant for a few eyes. His words now face the public, printed each morning and read over breakfast tables and in crowded shelters. The newsroom has its own rhythm. Typewriters clatter steadily. Editors lean close to one another, voices low. Coffee grows cold beside stacks of paper. Carr writes leader columns, deliberate. He knows that words matter differently now. They can steady a mood or unsettle it. The war sharpens his sense of purpose. He watches Europe tear itself apart for a second time within a generation. The failure of the old peace feels undeniable. When Germany invades the Soviet Union, Carr feels a shift. Not triumph, not relief, but recognition. The Soviet Union, once distant and controversial, now stands as a central force against a common enemy. Carr sees in this not only military significance, but historical meaning. A moment when old divisions might give way to new cooperation. In his writing, he argues for understanding this alliance honestly, not as a temporary convenience, but as a foundation for the future. He believes that lasting peace will require new economic and political arrangements, not a return to the fragile systems that failed before. His editorials reflect this conviction. They speak of reconstruction, of planning, of the need to confront unemployment and inequality, not after the war, but as part of winning it. To Carr, these are not abstract ideas. They are lessons drawn from collapse, from depression, from treaties that punished rather than healed. He imagines a post-war Europe shaped by cooperation rather than revenge, one where economic security reduces the hunger for conflict, one where power is balanced, not ignored. But his stance does not go unchallenged. Some readers bristle at his sympathy for the Soviet role. Others accuse him of naivete. A few see danger where he sees possibility. Even fellow writers raise their eyebrows. Sharp tongues question whether his realism has tilted too far. One critic, known for his clarity and skepticism, publicly rebukes what he sees as Carr's excessive faith. Carr reads these critiques quietly. He does not respond with anger. He understands disagreement. He has spent years watching ideas collide. Late at night, after deadlines pass, he remains at his desk. The newsroom empties. The city outside is still. Only the soft hum of distant generators breaks the silence. He thinks about the future, about how peace might be built differently this time, about whether planning can replace chaos, about whether societies can learn from their own wreckage. He writes pamphlets as well as columns, short works meant to spark thought beyond the day's headlines. In them, he sketches possibilities for a transformed Europe, ideas that will later seem hopeful to some, misguided to others. Yet, beneath all this, there is a human note. Carr is not blind to suffering. He hears the sirens. He sees the cues. He knows the cost of war is paid by ordinary lives. This awareness deepens his resolve. He believes that rebuilding must be more than physical. It must be social, economic, moral. The blackout curtains remain drawn. The typewriters continue their rhythm. And Carr keeps writing, convinced that ideas, even contested ones, must be tested in public if they are to matter. As the war years stretch on, his voice becomes familiar to readers. Not comforting, but steady. Insistent on looking forward rather than back. And so we leave him there, under a single lamp, ink drying on the page, imagining a different Europe while the old one burns. Part 8 ending. Blackouts and the editor's lamp. In the hush of blackouts, Carr's editorials imagine rebuilding before the smoke clears, planning peace even as bonds still fall. Keep that planning in your pocket. We now follow him into quieter rooms, where public pages give way to private study. Let's start. Chapter 9. We enter a quieter room in Edward Carr's life. a place where private choices and public work sit side by side. Imagine a college in autumn. Stone walls warmed by the low sun. Leaves drifting across a quiet quad. Inside, a study smells of paper and tea. A single lamp throws a small pool of light over a desk. This is where Carr spends his days after the war. The bustle of the newsroom has faded. The urgency of daily editorials has given way to longer afternoons of reading and thought. He moves between rooms of college and library stacks. His life becomes measured by chapters, not headlines. There are changes that are not written in the newspapers. Relationships shift. Households rearrange. What was once a public rhythm becomes more private. He learns the strange balance of being known and also alone. Work becomes a steady companion. He accepts fellowships at Oxford and then returns to Trinity College, Cambridge. These positions give him time to think, and time to follow a single idea until it grows large. He sets himself a vast task: to write a full history of the Soviet state. Not a brief essay, but a long labor of archives, documents, and patient translation. It will be many volumes. It will take years. Days begin with tea and a quiet list. Which folder to open? Which report to follow next? He reads reports in 3 languages. He measures sources against each other. He notes local accounts as closely as official memos. There is a rhythm to this work. Fetch a volume, note a passage, cross-check a date, write a paragraph, let it sit. Return with fresh eyes. Repeat. This is meticulous work. It is not glamorous. It requires long evenings and stubborn patience. It also requires care for people's lives contained in dry reports. He tries to keep the human thread in sight. Sometimes he worries aloud to friends. Will this matter? Will the long lists and the footnotes reach beyond the university reading rooms? He keeps doubts like stones in his pocket. They remind him to be humble. Teaching becomes part of the daily fabric. He holds small seminars and talks with students over cups of tea. Young minds press questions into his quiet hours. They ask about method, about bias, about how one balances sympathy and critique. He answers slowly. He urges them to listen to archives rather than to slogans, to follow contradictions rather than force them into tidy narratives, to remember that sources are voices, often many of them, often imperfect. Letters cross his desk from other scholars. Some praise, some disagree. He reads each with care. Replying takes time, and he replies in long, thoughtful notes. These exchanges sharpen thinking. They also keep him connected to a wider conversation that stretches beyond the college walls. At home, simple routines anchor him. A late walk by the river, bread and cheese shared with a friend, a small radio playing the evening news in the next room. These small comforts temper the isolation of long research. There are losses too. Friends drift. Some arguments remain unresolved. The private rooms of his life hold quiet regrets. But they also hold daily consolations. The way a lamp warms a page, the sound of rain on a window, the steady turning of a book's spine. As the volumes take shape, he grows more exacting. He asks uncomfortable questions of his sources. He notes where an archive is silent. He wonders why some voices are missing. He learns that absence is itself a clue. Those who read his early drafts notice the care. They see a mind that tries to be fair to evidence, not merely to argument. They see an effort to bring complexity into plain sentences, so that readers can follow the thought without being lost in jargon. Even so, he never mistakes scholarship for consolation. He knows that writing history does not repair every wound. It can, however, offer a clearer view. It can show how choices made in haste echo for decades. In the evenings, when the lamps are low and the college quiets, he places a fresh sheet on the typewriter. The sound of the keys becomes a small, steady metronome for the years ahead. He writes about harvests and factory reports, about decrees and private letters. He writes because the past, to him, remains insistently alive. This work also changes him. His voice in public becomes more reflective. He can no longer be satisfied with simple claims. He has seen how human lives are tangled in institutions and ideas. And so, in the hush of a Cambridge study, private doubts and scholarly purpose sit together like old companions. They rise at the same time each morning and sit with him through long afternoons. They remind him that the life of the mind is rarely separate from the life of the heart. Part 9 ending. Private rooms and public pages. The newsroom fades and the study grows, and with it, a long labor begins. Patient research that tastes like a lifetime's work. Let that patient rhythm settle. Next, the archive opens wide and the volumes begin to take shape. Let's start chapter 10. We step into a small, lamplit room stacked with paper, a place where patience becomes a form of craft. Imagine a study at dusk. Shelves lean with books. Bundles of typescripts lie in careful rows. Some pages are marked with pencil notes. Other sheets are stained from too many cups of tea. A thin, persistent scent of ink hangs in the air. This is the world Edward Carr has chosen. Not a world of quick opinions, but of slow work, of reading, checking, and reading again. In the years after the war, he sets himself a huge task: to tell the story of a nation remade in a short, violent time. Not as a single headline, but as a long, patient record. He works through official reports, local newspapers, private letters, minutes from meetings, farmers' complaints, factory logs. Each source is a small light. Some shine clearly, some are dim or flickering. Carr learns to treat them all with care. He weighs the testimony of an official alongside the note scrawled by a clerk. He listens for contradictions, for gaps, for what is left unspoken. There is an intensity to this work that looks like solitude from the outside. But it is not loneliness alone. It is an insistence on accuracy, a refusal to let grand narratives stand without the mortar of detail. He writes in long sittings. Fingers find the typewriter keys with steady motion. A paragraph becomes a small achievement. A chapter, a small victory. The volumes multiply slowly, each one folded into place like a careful garment. Alongside these heavy tomes, Carr reaches for a different question. Not just what happened, but how we know what happened. He begins to think about historians themselves, about the choices they make, about the lenses they bring to evidence. A fact, he sees, does not announce itself fully. It must be found, framed, and joined to other facts to make meaning. To explain this, he chooses a gentle image. Think of facts as notes scattered on a floor. The historian gathers them, arranges them, listens for melody. The tune depends on which notes are picked and which are left aside. That is not deceit, it is craft. This idea grows into a short book that reads like a quiet conversation. It does not parade its authority. It asks readers to pay attention to how history is made, to notice that every telling involves choices, to understand that humility is part of honesty. When that book appears, some are surprised by its modest tone. Others find it clarifying. Students pick it up in small libraries. A new generation begins to ask different questions. Not only who won or lost, but how the story was put together. In seminars and tutorials, Carr becomes a careful teacher. The rooms are small, and the chairs creak. A few graduate students gather close. They bring questions like lanterns. He answers slowly. He encourages them to follow evidence wherever it leads, to be skeptical of their own certainty, to keep notes neat and doubts nearer than certainties. He writes long letters to younger scholars. He corrects a citation here. He offers a reading suggestion there. He praises good footnotes with a modest, almost shy pleasure. These exchanges are not about fame. They are about making a community of careful readers. Outside the study, life continues in ordinary rhythms. A walk by the river, a sandwich shared with a colleague, a chat over tea in a college room where voices tumble quietly into the afternoon. These small comforts steady him through the long labor. There are difficult days, archives that close unexpectedly, files that cannot be found, reports that contradict one another. On those evenings, he sits with his hands folded. He admits uncertainty on the page. He tries not to rush the shape of an argument. This humility before his sources becomes part of his method. He writes not to fix the past in one neat frame, but to assemble a careful map that others can follow and test. He wants the reader to see the footsteps he took, and sometimes the missteps too. As the volumes accumulate, they change conversations. Scholars in other cities write back with new evidence. Debates move from bold assertions to slower, more detailed exchanges. The story he offers is not the last word. It is a long invitation to continue the work. His shorter book on the nature of history finds its place on many desks. It is read by students who will later teach, and by curious readers who want to understand how the past is shaped. They carry its ideas into seminars, into essays, into the questions they ask their own pupils. And through all this work, Carr remains a man with habits. A lamp that he lights at the same hour each evening. A habit of underlining a sentence twice before cutting it. A pile of unanswered letters that he returns to day after day. There is also a tenderness in his attentions. He notices the small human traces in official documents. A complaint about a missing horse. A child's illness recorded in a ledger. These details to him are not distractions. They are the very stuff of lived life, the texture that gives weight to broader claims. When he teaches, he urges students to remember the human faces behind data, to consider how women, farmers, and factory hands move through history. He asks them to read slow, and to ask why the sources were created in the first place. Over time, his reputation grows. He is invited to speak in other cities. He receives honors that arrive with quiet ceremonies. He accepts them with the same measured reserve with which he wrote his books. Yet the real reward, he often says, is the work itself. The long satisfaction of a paragraph set right. The tiny clarity when two sources finally line up. The steady unfolding of a complex moment into something understandable. As night falls and the lamp burns low, he looks across the study to the stacks he has made. They are not trophies. They are traces of years spent listening hard to the past. There is a slow triumph in that. Not the triumphant shout of a finished battle, but the gentle satisfaction of a life given to patient excavation. If this quiet hour with history has brought you calm, you may like the video or subscribe for more evenings like this. You can leave a thought in the comments if you wish. Part 10 ending. Iron quill on red paper. Piece by careful piece, Carr assembles the past, discovering that truth often lives inside contradictions rather than neat answers. Carry that sense of careful listening forward. Now we watch him navigate the cold shadows of a divided world. Let's start chapter 11. We stay with Edward Carr in his later years, when the world feels divided and certainty is harder to hold. Picture a university town in the long shadow of the Cold War. Stone paths cool under evening air. Windows glow gently behind drawn curtains. The sound of footsteps fades quickly here, replaced by the hush of thought. Carr is older now. His hair is thinner, his movements slower. But his mind remains alert, restless, unwilling to sleep through history as it unfolds. The world he observes is no longer stitched together by a single conflict. It is split. East and West. Allies and rivals. Ideologies facing one another like mirrors that refuse to reflect the same image. He follows the news carefully. Speeches from Moscow. Changes in leadership. New slogans. New promises. He listens as old certainties loosen and new ones struggle to take shape. When reforms appear in the Soviet world, he watches with cautious interest. He notices hope stirring, then faltering. When tensions rise between former allies, he studies the split with a historian's eye. He does not rush to judgment. He looks for patterns, for echoes of earlier moments. Carr remains committed to ideas that many now find uncomfortable. He continues to believe that economic forces matter deeply, that power shapes choices, that history rarely moves in straight lines. This stance draws attention, sometimes admiration, often criticism. Public debates follow him. Reviews question his judgments. Commentators accuse him of stubbornness, of holding on too tightly to ideas born in another age. Carr listens. He reads what others write about him. He does not always agree, but he does not dismiss them either. There is a quiet sadness in this period. Not despair, but the sadness of watching hopes collide with realities once again. The sadness of knowing that no system, however promising, escapes contradiction. He speaks out when he feels compelled. During moments of international crisis, he questions official narratives. He reminds audiences that power is often wrapped in language meant to reassure, that moral certainty can hide uncomfortable interests. Some find this unsettling. Others find it clarifying. He engages with younger thinkers who challenge older frameworks. Students and activists bring new questions to his door. They speak of liberation, of culture, of voices long ignored. Carr listens carefully. He does not always follow them where they want to go, but he respects their seriousness. He recognizes the energy of a new generation trying to name its moment. There are evenings when he feels out of step, when the arguments around him seem sharper, faster, less patient than he prefers. He retreats to familiar habits: reading, walking, thinking. Honors arrive quietly. Memberships, invitations. They acknowledge his influence, even as disagreement persists. He accepts them with modest courtesy. Recognition matters less to him than the work itself. The ongoing effort to understand how societies change and why they so often repeat their mistakes. As years pass, his tone grows more reflective, less urgent, still firm. He understands now that ideas do not age gracefully. They are tested, stretched, sometimes distorted by new conditions. What once seemed revolutionary can become controversial. What once felt obvious can turn fragile. On evening walks through college grounds, Carr lets these thoughts settle. Leaves crunch softly underfoot. The air cools. Students pass, absorbed in their own conversations, their own futures. He wonders how his work will be read. What will be taken forward? What will be argued against? He knows that disagreement is not failure. It is evidence that ideas still live. There is peace in this understanding. Not comfort, exactly, but acceptance. History, he knows, is never finished. Each generation reshapes it, questions it, pushes back against what it inherits. As dusk deepens, Carr turns back toward home. The path familiar, the questions still open. If this quiet reflection has eased your thoughts, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe for more gentle journeys through history. You may also share your reflections if you wish. Part 11 ending: cold shadows and quiet arguments. In a century of rival blocks and loud claims, Carr remains a steady, questioning presence, welcoming debate as proof of life. Hold the hum of those debates gently. At last, we come to the final lamplit reflections of his long life. Let's start chapter 12 and last one. We come to a gentle closing of a long and thoughtful life. Imagine a small study in Cambridge. A single lamp burns on a crowded desk. Books stand in patient rows. Papers are stacked like careful promises. The window shows a darkened quad and the faint shimmer of the river beyond. Edward Carr is older now. His steps are measured. His voice is softer when he speaks. There is a quiet about him that comes from long work and many questions. In these years he writes still, not with the same fever of youth, but with the steady hand of someone who has learned to listen to the past. Essays gather into collections. Short pieces become thoughtful books. His writing widens rather than rushes. He accepts honors along the way. They arrive as quiet notes and small ceremonies. A medal here, an invitation there. He takes them with the same reserve with which he accepted most things in life. But what matters most to him is the work itself. The patient shaping of sentences. The trying to make sense where things feel messy. He keeps returning to the same central habit. A refusal to accept tidy answers when the evidence will not allow them. The Cold War hums in the world beyond his window. New conflicts and disputes appear in newspapers. Young thinkers argue with fresh passion. Carr listens to them with interest, and sometimes with a hint of perplexity. He admires their energy even when he does not share their certainty. In conversation, he often returns to small details. A bureaucratic memo that reveals more than its author intended. A farmer's complaint that opens a window onto daily life. He values these fragments because they are honest in a way grand speeches are not. He keeps a steady routine. Mornings for reading, afternoons for writing, evenings for letters and small company. Friends drop by with news. Former students come to talk of their work. They bring questions and a kind of respectful impatience. Sometimes he feels the tug of regret. Not large regrets, not the dramatic kind, but small, human ones. Missed chances to say more. Moments when a heedless remark may have reached farther than intended. He holds these quietly, like pebbles in a pocket. He also holds a sense of wonder. How many lives pass through a single century? How patterns repeat, transformed by new machinery and new speech. How people in different places try similar experiments and face similar disappointments. He writes essays that look backward and forward at once. He asks how history has shaped the present. He asks how the present will one day be read. His tone is not triumphant. It invites reflection rather than demands assent. Students and colleagues continue to debate his judgments. Some praise his clarity. Others critique his positions. He is content with such debate. To him, disagreement is the sign of a living field, not its failure. On winter evenings, he walks slowly through the college grounds. Frost sometimes dusts the grass. The lamps cast pools of light along the paths. He moves with the calm of someone who has become accustomed to uncertainty. At home, he reads letters from readers around the world. Not all of them agree with him. Many thank him for the care of his work. A few tell stories of how a particular sentence changed the way they thought about a problem. These small notes give him pleasure that honors never quite matched. He thinks occasionally about legacy, not as an anxious worry, but as a quiet curiosity. Which of his pages will still be read? Which arguments will be reworked and remade by others? He knows that ideas travel in strange ways. They are reshaped, borrowed, tested. Some return changed, others fade. He does not demand immortality. He hopes only that the questions he raised will continue to be asked. As the years move on, his pace slows further. He continues to write when energy allows. He edits, revises, and simplifies. He chooses clarity over flourish. He values the reader's time. One autumn day, in a house warmed by a small fire, he falls ill. Friends visit. A few students bring newspapers and sit quietly at his bedside. There are conversations about books, about method, about the odd persistence of human folly and kindness. When he dies in Cambridge in the autumn of 1982, the town wakes to the quiet of a life that has ended. The news is modest. Obituaries note the work. Students remember his seminars. Colleagues recall the lamp that burned late into the night. At his study, the lamp is finally put out. A small, gentle ceremony marks the passing. His books remain on the shelf. Notes he made in margins keep their private comments. They are traces of a mind that kept making room for new evidence. In the hush that follows, there is no sudden judgment. There is instead a conversation left open. A set of questions that will continue to be debated, refined, and argued over by those who follow. What did he teach us in the end? Perhaps this: that history is never a simple ledger, that facts require careful gathering, that interpretation must be honest about its limits, that compassion for human lives alongside clear-eyed analysis is possible. As the lamp is gently extinguished in that quiet room, the scent of paper lingers. His questions echo softly, like footsteps down a long corridor. If this evening's story has helped you unwind, you may like the video or subscribe for more quiet journeys through lives lived with thought and care. You can also leave a gentle note in the comments if you wish. After his notebooks were closed and his lecture halls emptied, Edward Carr's questions kept walking out into the world. Scholars argued over his pages. Policy debates borrowed his caution. Cold War arguments folded his realism into new certainties, then tore them apart again. Today, his voice still surfaces, in conversations about how we read the past, how power bends promises, and how careful truth-telling might still matter in a noisy age. So why does Carr matter tonight? Because whether you're scrolling headlines at midnight or tracing the small decisions that shape your day, his central question quietly waits. How do we know what we think we know, and what responsibility follows from that knowing? The answers keep shifting, as history always does. But Carr's life leaves us a habit more than a solution: to listen slowly, to check the sources, and to hold our certainties lightly. Now, as the lamp in his study would finally be put out, let his questions rest with you. If these calm journeys help you unwind, a gentle tap of the like button and a quiet subscribe mean the world. Share a thought in the comments. What line of Carr's thinking stayed with you tonight, and which life should we visit next? Close your eyes, breathe out, and we'll meet again soon for another story. Sleep well.